legibly, not too fast. There was a demand a popular demand to bring back the candy thing from a couple of years ago. So you'll see some of my staff standing in the aisles. They've got a big silver bowl of candy. I solicited some of the professional athletes on my staff so that we have better aim this year. But the idea is I'm going to ask you questions. I'm going to try to keep you awake, and they're going to try to hit you and not your neighbor if you get the right answer. If you're close enough, you can probably just hand it, but we're going to try. So what I'm going to do is present an update on GDUFA 2. We're in year 1 of GDUFA 2, as I'm sure you know. I'm going to give a little bit of an update on where things stand. What I'd like to do is talk about some of the changes from GDUFA 1 to GDUFA 2, where we stand in the annual cycle, because this is really an ongoing thing. A lot of people think of user fees as a once a year and then we're done, but from my office's perspective, we're working on this stuff year round. I want to give an update on how the implementation of GDUFA 2 went, because we're now in the first year of GDUFA 1 and we're past that huge bolus of a lot of the stuff that happens on October 1. And then I want to leave you with a couple of words. Now, we only have 20 minutes, and so I'm going to try and cram a lot of stuff in here. But some of my previous tasks have focused on the 10 top ways to screw up your application or incur fees you don't want to incur. Most of that has gone by the wayside. You guys have done a great job of knowing how to work the system and stuff like that, so we don't have a lot of those left. But there are a handful of things that we've seen that we'd like to make sure you're aware of as well. So without further ado, I want to go over what's happened in GDUFA 2. One of the biggest things that happened during the negotiations for GDUFA 2 was the introduction of the program fee. And this was a concept where if you or your affiliates own a certain number of ANDAs, approved ANDAs, you fall into either a small tier, a medium tier, or a large tier, and then the fee that you pay is based on which tier you're in. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the expectations matched the reality and how things have turned out. But that fee came into place and took up accounted for about a third or so of the target revenue for that year. Another issue that came in was the CMO concept. So first candy question, and we should have one bowl over here, is who knows what CMO means or stands for? And obviously, for those of you from around the world on the webcast, we can't give you candy, but we're going to do that for those here. So who knows what CMO means? Okay, all right. So and more than one person can win. So if you get it right, make sure my folks see you and give you the candy. So contract manufacturing operation organization means basically if you manufacture drugs but you don't own the drugs, if you have no ownership stake in those drugs, the argument during negotiations was you're not really an owner of that application, you don't have the same exposure to the profit. And so there was an arrangement to work out a lower fee. So they pay 1/3 of the fee that a typical facility would pay. Another thing that happened during the negotiations is we decided to remove the PAS fee, the supplement fee. So now there's a filing fee for the ANDA itself, but not for PASs. One of the arguments here was sometimes, and they did the same thing on the PDUFA side, by the way, sometimes there's a labeling issue that might require submission of a PAS, and the company doesn't want to pay for it. From a public health or public safety perspective, we wanted that to go in. So there was some tension about getting these PASs submitted. So by removing that fee, we removed that disincentive for companies to change their labeling as needed. Another change that was a big one actually was no more pending facility fees. So under GDUFA 1, if you had a facility that was referenced in an application, whether that application was approved or not, that facility incurred the facility fee. And under GDUFA 1, as I'll reference later, the facility fees accounted for a huge portion of, or a large portion of GDUFA 1 target revenue. So second candy question, does anybody know what that percentage was? Percentage of the target revenue that facilities are responsible for in GDUFA 1. 70? There we go. Got a couple over here. So one of my staff raised her hand and she's not eligible. So under GDUFA 2, if your facility and you're referenced in a pending application, you're not charged that fee until October 1 of the year after you get approved. And this was a big thing because some companies had maybe 1 or 2 applications that they were referenced in. They weren't making any generic drug products, so they had no economic activity to compensate them for that annual fee. And so this was a way of taking care of some of the concerns that people raised during GDUFA 1. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about this on the next slide, but there was a shifting dependence on the fee type. So in other words, like we just heard, under GDUFA 1, the facilities accounted for 70% of the target revenue. The GDUFA 2 shifted that around so that the distribution is a little more even. So here's what I mean by that. Under GDUFA 1, for example, the FDF and API facility fees together accounted for the 70% of target revenue. In GDUFA 2, that's down to 27%, so it shifted from almost 3/4 to a little more than 1/4. To make up for that, the ANDA and PASS fee, well, the ANDA fee now went from 24% to 33%, so it's a little bit more reliance on the filing fee. And then this new program fee accounted for 35%, so a little over 1/3. The DMF fee changed a little bit, but not too much. The biggest change here was the total size of the program. It went from $323 million at the end of GDUFA 1 to $493 million at the beginning of GDUFA 2. So that was a substantial change. So those are the major changes under GDUFA 2. There were others, but because I've only got 20 minutes today, I don't really have time to go into them. I wanted to next move to the annual cycle. Like I mentioned earlier, for my office, this is an ongoing thing. We always have something going on. And I wanted to sort of highlight what those major elements are, because that's going to then impact the implementation discussion that's after that. So I'm using as a timeline the fiscal year. The federal fiscal year starts on October 1, goes through September 30th, and this is what drives the user fees. So the first thing that happens on October 1 is, of course, fees are due, right? That's when everyone has to pay their fees for the programs, for the facilities. The ANDA fees, obviously, are when you submit the application. After that, this session is a couple of days too late for this, but the beginning of April is a notable date for you. Because I said earlier that the program fee is a function of the number of approved ANDAs that you and your affiliates own, there's an opportunity for you to tell the agency that you're going to withdraw some of your ANDAs. I'm going to talk a little bit about this more on the next slide. But if you can get from, say, 21 applications down to 19, that moves you from the large tier into the medium tier. And that saves you $400,000 in change. So that's definitely worth something if you can do that, if it makes sense for you to withdraw those applications. And so because we know it can take time to process these things, the way the negotiators worked it out was to say, if you can tell the agency by April 1 that you're going to withdraw your ANDAs and you submit the paperwork to do so, then even if we can't get those officially withdrawn by the next fee due date, October 1st, we're going to not count it against you. So let's say that you have 21 ANDAs, you tell us by April 1st you're going to withdraw 2, and then you submit the paperwork for it, and for whatever reason the agency can't get around to withdrawing it formally, you're not going to be charged the large program fee tier, you're going to be charged the medium tier. So this is an important date for those of you who are on the cusp and who can sort of shift into a lower tier. We're now, 13 days after that, or whatever the date is today. So that's something to keep in mind for next year. What we do with that information internally is we take that expectation of how many people are going to have how many ANDAs, which tiers that makes them fall into, and we use that to set the denominators, which is a key step in setting the fees for the coming year. So that's why we need that information, and that's why having it by that date is helpful for us. So in my office, we set those fee denominators, we send that information over to the Office of Financial Management, they do the math, they calculate the fees, and then they publish those fees in the FR, the Federal Register, around the beginning of August every year. So it's in August that you know, a couple months ahead of time, what the fees are going to be for the next fiscal year. And then on September 30th, that's when the fees become due. So one thing I wanted to point out is some people get a little confused about this, but it's the profile you have on that date that matters. It's not the April 1st timeline. It's not whenever you come in and tell us what your program fee work is. Whatever profile you have on September 30th, October 1, that's what's going to drive your fee, your tier. So if you're going into that and you've told us that you're withdrawing and we still haven't gotten it done, and on October 1 it looks like you have 21 applications or approved applications, if you've told us before April 1, then you're going to be charged a medium fee tier. If you didn't get that information into us until after April 1, and the agency wasn't able to get those withdrawn, then you're going to be charged a large program fee tier. So it's your profile at that point in time that drives your profile. So just again, to keep that in mind, that's the importance of this date. All along this time, as I mentioned, this is an ongoing thing for us. We're accepting information from you about your program or about your approved applications. So over time, you may get more approvals. You may decide to withdraw some things. You may sell some things. You may buy some things. So we will be opening up to the public a web-based reporting tool on April 30th. It'll go live at the end of this month, which will allow you to send stuff into us. So remember last year there was this big, for the beginning of GDUFA 2, there was this big effort to make sure that our information was correct and up to date. So we published these Excel spreadsheets that said, we think you have this many approved applications, tell us if we're wrong. Instead of having to send us an email, we're going to have this web-based portal which will allow you to do that same thing for us. That will go live at the end of this month. There'll probably be some bugs. We'll be working it out. But it's going to be for FY20, not FY19. So some of you have been telling us which changes have happened, and we've been recording those for the program fee. So please continue to do that. We've only gotten, I think, 78 or so responses for this year out of the 300 and change that we're expecting, which means either that our information's right and you don't feel the need to tell us, we would like you to tell us, but you don't have to, or the companies listed maybe have gone bankrupt or they're no longer in business or something. So we like the certainty of knowing, so if you could tell us, we'd appreciate it. But this new thing that's coming out at the end of this month will be for 2020, not FY19. So I want to give you an update on how implementation went for year one. I'm going to use the program fee as an example. I'll talk about the CMO fee as well. But this is a complicated slide. This sort of violates all those PowerPoint rules they tell you not to violate, so I apologize. But what I want to do is sort of lay out how this slide works. And so there's going to be 3 sets of information. The first one is the amounts that we published in the FR notice for the beginning of GDUFA 2. And this was our best guess for how many things were going to fall into the small tier, or how many entities would be in the small, medium, and large tiers. The next bar, oops, I'm sorry, I'll go bar by bar. So in the FR notice, we estimated, based on what we knew at the time, and this was again around, say, June-ish or so of that year, we thought there'd be 258 small companies, 52 medium, and then 62 large. So if you know that you're in the large and you have maybe 1 or 2 into that tier, in other words, 21, 22 approved applications for you and your affiliates, you might want to try to get into the medium. Similarly, if you're in the medium and you're close to the small, you might try to get into the small. So what we expected and what we saw is that by October 1, when the fee profile was established, we had a lot of people move up into the small category, or down in the small category, whichever. We had more people move into the medium, and we had some people drop out of the large. So there was this shifting, which we anticipated, of people moving into the next lower tier. And that was because they wanted to manage their user fee liability, which makes a lot of sense. So as of today, or as of this, the numbers haven't changed from today, but these are from a couple of days ago. We had 175 entities come in and pay their small tier fee for the program fee. We had 45 come in for the medium and then 53 for the large. So that's where we stand now. So I think it actually speaks pretty well that we've gotten these numbers fairly close. You'll notice obviously that on the small category we're below the 266 we expected. But there we have examples of companies that are bankrupt or have gone out of business. They weren't around to tell us they were out of business, which makes sense. When we were coming up with the estimates for the FR publication in August, we made assumptions about how many companies are likely to be bankrupt. And so we factored some of those in. We didn't factor in as many as maybe we should have, but we got a lot closer than the original numbers. If I put the original numbers up here, you would see a much bigger gap. So this is sort of an example of the year one program fee. I didn't have the real estate or the time to put some of the CMO information in, but I did want to let you know that in the FR notice, when we published it, we expected 168 CMO companies or entities to come in. And as of now, we've gotten 177. So we were fairly close on that front as well. So in the words to the WISE department, I wanted to bring a couple of things up. And one thing I wanted to encourage you to do was to monitor our website. We're going to be putting information up there. This program portal that I mentioned earlier, we're going to post it on our website. We're going to send it out through the listservs. Hopefully you all are on those listservs. I'm going to put it on my LinkedIn page, so if you're linked in with me, you'll get a little notice there. But every time we have changes like this, we do try to keep you informed, so we do try to put things up on the website. This whole long thing is a link, so if you have the materials, you can just click on it. The alias for it is www.fda.gov/GDUFA. It's a lot easier to remember. You can just type that in, and that'll take you right there. Another thing is, some people are approaching us with questions that indicate they're not sure about the distinction between approved, discontinued, and withdrawn. For fee purposes, which of these, for the program fee, another candy question, which of these incurs program fee liability? Approved and discontinued? Anybody say withdrawn? Good, thank you. Everyone gets candy, okay. Yeah, that's the point. So some people think if they say something is discontinued, they don't have to pay a fee. That's not the case. So if you want to make sure that your approved ANDA does not count against you or count for the program tier, you have to make sure it's withdrawn. And that's why that April 1 date again is so important. You need to tell us that, because if you don't tell us by April 1, then you're hoping that the agency can get that paperwork processed in time. And it may, sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't. So it's just a better way to do it. From a program fee perspective, there's no distinction between approved and discontinued. If you're marketing it or not, if it's an approved application, it's going to count. Another common misperception is that if I self-ID, I am liable for a fee. Is that true or false? False, good. More candy for everyone. So the issue here is that people think if they go into an FDA system, assault by candy. If you go into the self-ID system and tell us about your operations, we're going to come and send you a bill. That's not the case necessarily. There are only certain types of business operations in self-ID that trigger fees. Anybody want to list some for more candy? So manufacturing is a big one. Sorry? Yeah, exactly. So how about testing? Take some candy away from you. No, testing, I'm just kidding. But yeah, so repackaging, relabeling, testing, those are the ones that don't incur fees. So, and then there's others where self-ID is required, but there's no liability associated with it. So if you're involved in certain activities outside the fee realm, you're still going to have to self-ID just because that's what the law requires. But we get questions where people think, well, I don't want to self-ID because that's going to incur a fee. Not necessarily. You're required to self-ID for reasons other than just fees. So we don't want people to violate any of those rules because they don't want to pay a fee. If you're going to pay a fee, you're going to have to do self-ID anyway. So that's just a common thing that we hear. And then I think that was all I had. We've got about 3 minutes left. My understanding is I'll be back up here for questions a little bit later. Should I take any questions now, or should I just move on? Save it for later? All right, so we're saving it for later. Okay.